Shall we start?
Sure. What's the topic of today?
I think we as probably most people have realized, um, have gone about this fairly spontaneously in the past. And you and I talked yesterday, and really felt like it was time to talk about COVID-19 and kind of how that's impacted our industry and our own businesses and what our outlook is going forward. So um, I'm I think both of us are probably by nature pretty optimistic people, but this has been an interesting time to be in the sheep business and be in California, hasn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has. It's definitely a challenge, and it's very easy to. I mean, yeah, it's very obvious. The bears are scaring away the bulls right now,
Yeah.
and that's definitely the factor. One reason why I think it's important we talk about this now is because at least when I've been reading the news, uh, there is so much misinformation, exaggerated information mixed in with the correct information. And
Yeah.
I'd like to hopefully take a little bit of time and try to clear some of that up today. And then maybe even the next one we do, we can actually add to this and dive deeper into some of those nuances that we couldn't really fully vet out today. So,
Yeah.
I think it's a good opportunity because really when this is a really good opportunity. You learn so much about your weaknesses during times of crisis because that's when they're shown. And that's why you have risk management, is to help buffer against these crazy unknown circumstances. And no economist in the world would have predicted that people would shut down everything due to a virus.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, none of the companies that are struggling now are struggling because they were poor business people, but it is an opportunity for us to look at our production system and see where the weaknesses kind of are, and hopefully learn from this for the future going on. And the next one's going to be different.
Yep. Yep. And I think there's an opportunity, I'm sure you're seeing this where you are. There's an opportunity to look at the businesses that are thriving right now in all of this and learn from some of the things. Some of it is just that they happen to be in a segment of the economy where they can stay up and running and there's a big demand for what they do. But I think there's some value in looking at what they've done successfully as well to be able to work through this period.
So I know it's your turn to lead, but I'm chomping at the bit to ask the first question.
Have at it.
So my first question is, there's a lot of news articles out there about the livestock industry, and the real attention grabbers are the ones where they're euthanizing livestock.
Right.
And so I think the first thing we ought to do is talk a little bit about what's really going on and what types of livestock that is happening in and what types of livestock it's not.
Yeah, and I actually had that conversation with a woman earlier today who was very interested in kind of local food systems. And her question for me was relative to the sheep business. Well, what happens if you just hold on to everything that you've got now for another year till things are back to normal? And it was an interesting perspective that I think is unique to the agricultural world and to the livestock world in particular, in that we make decisions in our sheep business. We made decisions last September that we wanted to have lambs born in February to be able to sell in June. And that's kind of the planning process that took place for us, not knowing that come June, we weren't going to be sure where or even if we would be able to sell those lambs given what's going on right now. So I think there are some differences, at least in my understanding, in different types of livestock with that. I think with cattle and sheep and goats, as ruminant animals, we have to make decisions so far in advance about breeding and about kind of where our markets are, that our options are different than they might be for somebody that's raising poultry or raising hogs, because that turnover is so much more rapid with chickens in particular, but also with hogs.
A lot of that's also due to the integration of the way the production systems lined up, where you have basically the pork and chicken farmers are contracted out multiple years in advance and are growing the livestock for the plant, and it's all a vertically integrated system where these animals, they know what they're going to sell to that packing house 2 years before the animal's even born. They have all of the soybeans bought, all the corn bought, all the piglets, everything's all hedged and put out there.
Whereas genetics are provided by the company, all of that.
Exactly. That system is where you are seeing the euthanization of animals. And it's because they had to slow down their chain speeds in the packing houses and shutter certain packing houses to a large percentage of the industry, which created that 10-20%, whatever the number is, that can't go into the following week or the following week or the following week. You can't compound those because there literally is, because they're so planned out so far ahead, they can't just continue to roll them because there's just not the ability to market them.
Right.
Whereas in beef and lamb, it's different.
Well, and I would put this question to you. We've talked about this a little bit in the past about the diversity in the lamb industry and the sheep industry. This is probably going to come as a great shock to most people who will be listening, all 10 or 12 of them, but we are a fairly independent bunch as an industry. And sometimes that can be a real benefit to us. Sometimes it can hold us back. But how do you think our independence and our diversity has impacted us in this time, in this period? Is it a strength for us?
Yeah, I think diverse opinions are always a strength as long as you have a table to sit down and discuss honestly between parties. I think when you refuse to listen to the diverse opinions, that's when you start to fail. But I think the big, if you would have asked me pre-COVID-19, what business model is more sustainable long-term, I could have made a really good argument that the vertical integration you see in poultry and chickens is a really attractive business model. However, this is showing the weaknesses of that kind of a system. And it's showing the strength of the lamb and beef side of the type of a system. Now, all systems have issues, but just the fact, we're livestock people. And if you go and you ask a farmer to kill every animal on his ranch, just look at what happens with the suicide rates in Australia when they did that to the sheep industry there. That you break their hearts, you break individuals' hearts, and we can't. I'm so proud of our industry that we're not at that point, that we do care about the livelihood of those animals. And it's not that the hogs and chickens don't care about their animals. They have to do that. Otherwise, that animal is going to die on its own. So it's a real tragic situation, but thankfully we're not in that spot. So
I think this is maybe going down a rabbit hole. We'll come back to it at some other point. But I think the mental health aspects of something like this, during our big drought, I did a lot of reading about the Dust Bowl years and about what ranchers went through in that time period. And I think knowing how much I love what I do, how much you love what you do, I can't imagine being in a spot where I'd have to destroy my life's work like that. And I think that's something we're going to have to be aware of and cope with coming out of this with our colleagues that are in other parts of the livestock business. I think it will take a toll.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely something that needs to be on the forefront as we navigate through this as industry organizations. They really need to start looking at, that mental health support, especially as this matures and if it doesn't correct. So in the beef and the lamb industry. So the pork and chicken are kind of separate.
Yep.
I think you kind of have to look at those. They're very related because they're cheaper proteins. They're vertically integrated. They're very systematic and they're very forward contracted. So they're very different than.
And they're not ruminants. I think.
And they're not ruminants. Yeah.
That's part of that fits all in that bigger piece.
Yeah. So I think that's important when you start reading news articles and start hearing these terror stories. When you see a news article that says livestock's being euthanized around the country and they show a picture of a cow and then you read the article and it's a bunch of pig and chicken farmers quoted, you need to separate those two because they are very different.
Yeah.
So then going to the beef and the lamb side, you have this really unique situation where box beef price is through the roof, or set some records here during COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Box lamb cutout values set a record last week. But yet you have the weekly slaughter numbers collapsing, and you have the cash paid to the farm gate collapsing.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to spend too much time on beef because we're sheep guys, and but I mean I do have a lot of cows, so I'm worried about it. But
yeah,
to me, they're similar problems on different scales.
Yeah. Right.
And so I think we can use the lambs to start kind of trying to dissect a little bit about exactly what's happening with these, you can call them rumors, arguments, realities, and, false realities about who's making money, who's not making money, who's a bad actor, who's not a bad actor. Is there price gouging? Is there not? All those kind of things I'd like to really kind of maybe step back and look at the lamb industry and see, I don't know if we should work back or how do you want to attack peeling that onion open as to what exactly is going on in the lamb industry?
I think working from the dinner plate backwards is probably a good way to do it. And I think because you and I have different marketing channels that we pursue, I think it'd be interesting to look at how that differs perhaps in our own businesses too. So maybe you could kind of start from that dinner plate and work backwards in terms of your product and describe what's going on.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm gonna actually probably start a little further back than that. But with the lamb product, the lamb is consumed by food service. They usually break it up into food service, which is restaurants and cruise ships and those kind of things, and then grocery store outlets, retail outlets, and then you have your direct sales are kind of the three main avenues. And I'll leave direct sales out because you know that through and through. So I'll concentrate on those two. One of the most important things to remember is not all packing house or packing businesses are equal. Every portfolio is different and unique based on how they wanted to set it up. Some were more exposed into food service than others. Some were more exposed into retail than others. And depending on how the company was exposed will directly affect their current performance and their current ability to go out and buy lamb on the open market and, have throughput. The other major issue that we have that's causing some of the price declines, I think it's really important to lay out that there is a facility, one of the larger facilities. There's 4 main facilities in the U.S., 2 in Colorado, 1 in California, 1 in Michigan. Yep. The Michigan facility was shut down because of some COVID-19 positives, and it's been shut down for 3 weeks or so. Then you have of the 2 in Colorado, the throughput's been slowed down in both of them. One of them was due to Chapter 11 bankruptcy filed by the parent company, and then the other, or in California, is that one has maintained their volume, but nothing impressive. And so just some interesting fact numbers as far as volume numbers. And I know this gets wonky for people listening. You're not supposed to talk about numbers, but for the first 15 weeks, this year versus last year, we are down 46,345 head.
And that's nationally?
That's nationally. Our peak of our national kill, or the most we tend to typically process, is about 40 to 45,000. So we're down an entire week's worth of supply or throughput in the first 15 weeks. 42,000 of that 46,000 were in the last 4 weeks.
So
it
off the table.
completely tanked. We went from 40 to we're about 30 now, 30,000 head a week. The way we're kind of projecting, or the trajectory, we should be around 100,000 head down from year over year by about week 19, week 20.
Wow.
And so that's a huge hit as far as volume going through the system. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but that volume number explains a lot about why the market in the cash side is crashing. I think the supply demand economics on that end of the pendulum are pretty easy to understand.
Right.
So now going back to the plate. So you serve your customers are these restaurants, which completely went to zero, or your restaurants where there's grocery stores that went through the roof.
Yep.
Well, when you sell into a restaurant, you package that meat differently than if you sell it to a grocery store. You're delivering different cuts, you're delivering different presentations, you're delivering different products. And so your whole fabrication line and distribution is set up completely different. So if you're supplying food service, you can't just flip a switch and start delivering that meat into a grocery store. You cannot do it from a logistics standpoint. It takes too much capital to change over your equipment, and it takes too much time to develop those markets. And vice versa is the same too. So, and then the other side of that is different cuts sell into those different areas. So your racks and center cuts, your real high-end dinner plate items, those sell real well in food service. They don't sell as well in the grocery store, because if you're going grocery shopping, you're going to pay $70 for a rack. But if you're going to go get 2 chops at a fancy restaurant, you pay $30 a plate, $40 a plate. So there's a big difference there. And so I guess I covered a lot in that. So I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about the direct marketing and kind of where that is, because there has been some boom in direct sales to households. And so
there has been, in this, what we kind of call as an industry, this non-traditional market, where we are selling directly to consumers. All of the farmers markets here where I am in the foothills have stayed open. And there are lamb producers that sell at those markets who have reported to me that their lamb sales, if they've got lamb, have gone through the roof. People are really stocking up. I think there's an interesting conversation to have about frozen inventory, and kind of, we know when it's frozen when the companies have it. We don't know how much frozen inventory is out there in people's home freezers. And I think that's something that's hard to grapple with from a market reporting standpoint. But those direct markets have really been booming. I was talking to a person here in California that does a lot of direct marketing to ethnic markets, largely in Muslim communities. And that's a little bit different type of lamb. We have sold into that system with a smaller lamb with some success in the past. Those smaller lambs are still worth a fair bit of money compared to what's happened in the finished lamb market. Surprisingly, because of that ethnic demand, there apparently are not enough goats available for sale in California anywhere. The goats that weigh what my lambs will weigh when we sell them are likely to be worth close to $3 a pound in June.
Wow.
And that's a supply and demand issue as well. But I think in terms of the direct markets, there is some relationship to what's going on in the restaurant and retail trade, in that most people who are direct marketing also have to rely on those other outlets to some extent. And there is some likelihood that we'll follow those markets a little bit. I think the issue on the direct marketing end is that little producers like me are a real pain for the processors to deal with. And I think necessarily they're having to look at their systems to make sure that they are are meeting their core customers' needs and their core suppliers' needs, and not taking on somebody that wants to bring 3 or 4 lambs a week at the expense of being able to continue to meet those other needs. And so I think there's the potential for some bottlenecks for these direct markets as well, partially driven by the fact that we all play by the same food inspection rules. And so we've got to have access to that USDA inspected processing to be able to direct market as well. And I think that can be a potential challenge.
So the one of the other factors that whenever you talk about markets, a lot of people always criticize and complain about the imports and how the imports are crashing our markets. I want to do a screen share with you real quick and show you this. You can go ahead and work on getting that on, and I'll ramble a bit.
Yep.
But I got a graph today that illustrates what's happened with the imports over the last since this COVID outbreak has happened, and our market has completely collapsed. But with that, so has the imports. This is U.S. lamb imports, and here in January we had I don't know, between 15 and 20 million pounds being imported, and it's been literally collapsed to less than 5 million pounds as of March. And so that's just one thing to remember, is the effect of imports on our markets could be negative or positive, whether they go up or down. Economics are very dynamic. And that's one thing this is really showing, is how dynamic they truly are, because there's so many fundamental indicators that should pose positive news for the ewe producer and that feeder.
Yeah.
But all of the actuality is negative.
Right. So
it's a fascinating little statistic there that I wanted to make sure I highlighted.
That's a remarkable graph, and that makes me think about what we may see as we come out of this, when we come out of this, in terms of domestic markets and production. What do you think the fall will look like if you had a crystal ball?
Really hard to project that far out with the economics being so unstable. And when you look at the lamb complex, the whole production system, there is a lot of negative pressure when you look at the basics of, we have 3 million sheep in the U.S. that go through annual inspection, or annually counted. And there's a chance we don't have a home for 500,000 to 1 million of those. And those economics are very troubling. You add the pressure of the labor issues that are going on right now for different ranches. You have the Chapter 11 in that large processor. You have the pullback of the other processor that's backed the supply up. There's a producer up there that had a supply agreement with that facility. He's been selling his lambs on the equity market auction. I think he just sold some for 80 cents a pound for fat. And it's because they canceled his contract, because they canceled it due to a force majeure act of God. Those very, very rarely that those clauses are enacted. But when you have that starting to happen, that's flooding the market with product. We actually started the year very current in our feedlot. If you look at the Colorado feedlot inventory, we were well below where we were a year ago. But in the matter of the last 4 weeks, we've reversed that. And typical year will be trending down throughout the summer in the Colorado inventory. Well, once COVID-19 hit and we started backing things up in mid-March, it completely reversed, and now we're above normal. And so we were about 10, 20,000 head below normal. Now we're above normal and going to continue to climb. And so that really poses some long-term risks. And that actually opens up a really good thing I wanted to talk about. So the way pricing works, you can look at it forward or backwards, but the ewe producer that goes out and buys a ewe and raises a ewe is speculating based on what he thinks he can sell a feeder lamb for. Mm-hmm. That feeder lamb buyer is speculating based on what he thinks he can get a fat lamb sold for. And that fat lamb buyer is speculating what he's going to get a retail price for. Now, the problem when you start speculating when the problem in pricing occurs when there's too many unknowns and it's too far out. And what has happened with COVID-19 is the cost of production at the fat level, so the between the feedlot finishing and the getting the product to retail, has had way too many unknowns enter into that because of the loss of half of the traditional market, which is the food service side.
Yep.
And so the next step of this that I wanted to quickly go through some more numbers was, if you take is how efficiencies work in that packing plant, and how reduction of chain speed is a compounding cost, much more than what you would think it would be. So if you're processing 100 head per hour, I'm just using raw numbers for simplicity, and your fixed cost, so your cost to have these people on the floor is $5,000 an hour. That's $50 per head is your cost. If you just reduce your chain speed 25%, that means you're processing 75 an hour and it costs you $5,000 to run that. That brings your cost up to $67 a head. So a 25% reduction in chain speed is a increased cost of 34%. And these older traditional plants, which we have a lot of in the United States, and if you've ever been through a beef packing house, you'll know what I'm talking about. These old facilities, as they've mechanized them and put things on, it's cramped the quarters and made people, they're very close together on the line. So when you reduce that chain speed and you're spreading people out 6 feet apart, you're slowing that chain speed down, in some cases more than 25%. And so that just compounds your cost per head, and that's an expense that you won't pick up in any report whatsoever. So you see the box beef cutout or the box lamb cutout costs, and you see it through the roof. Well, you have a huge difference in expense just because they're not processing the same number of animals, and their efficiency equation has been flipped around. And if you can't control your efficiency equation, you have no idea. Just on this 25% example, there's a 34% swing in your cost of production. Yeah. That's huge for a business that's running on a 10% return.
Yeah, and without a way to pass that cost along. I mean,
well, the way is to buy it cheaper, right? And if you have a large supply, or sell it for more, and they're selling it for more on the retail to make up for that, and they're able to buy it cheaper if you have those accounts. But if you don't have the accounts, all of those people you said you were going to buy their animals for, you can't buy them anymore because you have no market to sell them into.
There's no place for them to go. Yeah.
And so it creates this kind of perfect storm where you have rising retail prices. I've heard the retail prices kind of leveled off a little bit. But the other side of this is the all-falls have disappeared too. The all-falls have made up 5-10% of the profit margin, per animal. I mean, that's a decent value for these processors. So no all-fall value, no leather value. Your international commerce has completely disappeared. And so you just add all these things together and it creates this giant unknown. So when you say what's a lamb going to bring next fall, right now I don't think you can really even put a price, because there's a large percentage of those lambs that might not get sold, which is a very scary thought from an industry standpoint. Because the other thing you mentioned at the very beginning is, once a lamb gets over 12 months old, it's no longer a lamb, and it cannot get sold into lamb channels. And that's the other major issue that we have that beef doesn't.
And regardless of the market, where the market is at that point, that animal is a drastically discounted animal in the marketplace, even in good times. If we go from lamb to mutton, that's a huge discount in the market. You know, I had this conversation with somebody from Wyoming earlier in the week, thinking about how we think creatively in a time like this, in light of all of those things that you were talking about. And I think one of the struggles that I see, at least in the folks that I've talked to, is that uncertainty creates a lot of anxiety. And in some cases, it's almost helpful to have a negative decision, because then you know what the rules of the road are rather than the uncertainty. Are there some things that you think would be helpful in terms of those kinds of decisions as an industry, whether it's a meat industry decision or an ag industry generally decision, that would help create a little bit more certainty in a time like this?
Yeah, I mean, certainty's at a premium in today's world, and nobody could have predicted this was going to happen. And it was completely shocking and took the whole world by storm. And so to think that the livestock or the agricultural industry would be exempt from this is kind of a false hope. Yeah. But I do think that it's a reminder that when you run your own business, that we have risk management is a big part of running a business. Yeah. And the reason you do risk management is for situations like this. You don't buy animals and plan on losing money on it and having the market go to heck. You manage your risk so you can afford them to go to heck. Right. And so it's really kind of a wake-up call, I think, to remember to reflect on your own risk management, your own risk tolerance. And we as a company, we actually we walked away from about 1,300 acres of irrigated pasture this last fall. And the reason we did it is because we felt our risk tolerance didn't justify the risk we would take in stocking that with speculative animals. Mm-hmm. Even with hedges, even with insurance, even with contracts, all those things, we walked away from that because we didn't feel as a company we could handle a major downturn in the market, whatever the cause. And now sitting here looking back, we are so blessed and thankful that we made that decision. And we didn't allow the pride of having more acres than the neighbor or being able to be the biggest cowboy on the block. We didn't allow that to inform our decision. We looked at that risk profile and made that decision. And I was just talking with Jeff and John today about how proud I am of us as a company to be able to do the analysis and recognize that and be willing to make that kind of a decision, because that was a hard decision to make. I mean, you're walking away from really profitable ground on a flat market, on a good market. But it was just one of those situations where when we were looking at our risk, we decided it was too risky. So back to like, how do you stay positive in a market like this? Well, one, your first loss is your cheapest loss often. Yeah. And so I don't know many businesses that'll be super profitable this year that didn't have aggressive risk management in place. And those companies that had aggressive risk management in place probably aren't profitable in the really good years. So, are super profitable. That's a whole balancing act. But don't be afraid to sell them cheap to get out from under them. Don't get talked into exaggerating the loss. If you have an opportunity into an ethnic market to sell them for a decent value, do it. If you have don't, but then at the same time too, communicate with the people that you work with year over year over year. Keep those communications going, because your relationships mean a lot in times like this, and people will help each other out, that are friends and things. And so don't be afraid to communicate. Don't be afraid to talk, and don't be afraid to be honest with yourself. Don't lie to your banker. I mean, the banks are set up to support people through these kinds of things, because this is they passed $2 trillion in relief, almost three, I think, through it all, just to help people. So go out and talk to people. Don't think you're going to just rough your way through it on your own. Really get out there, engage, talk to your FSA offices about what programs are available. New ones are coming out all the time. But just, stay involved, stay engaged, there is going to be relief. And I know there's a lot of negative economic pressures, but there's always positive opportunities in these negative situations, because no company is built exactly the same and no company has the same risk. If you can start doing home deliveries one at a time, now might be a great time to do that. Develop those kind of markets. You take a cost of product that now is worth nothing. Well, it's a lot cheaper to go ahead and maybe custom harvest a handful of those and try some marketing.
Yeah.
It's a really good opportunity to try some of these things that maybe you've been wanting to, but then at the same time, remembering your risk tolerance and not extending yourself. The worst thing you can do, I think, is to just think that it's just going to get better tomorrow and just whatever you call it, trying to pass the buck down the road rather than trying to be adaptable and react, and proactive.
Compounding works both ways. It can work for you and against you, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the idea of communicating internally and externally is really important in terms of risk management. I think one of the things that we've done here in the foothills is we've got this network of folks that are all willing to share details about their businesses with one another, with the idea that it helps to have somebody else's perspective on it. And so, as an example, this last fall, we were short of feed after breeding and before we would normally go to the hills, and mentioned that to this group. And lo and behold, somebody had some extra alfalfa that we could go to and bought us, 4 weeks of grazing where we could rest our hill ground that much longer and grow some more feed there. I think many times our industry, because we are individualists, coming back to that idea a little bit, we're embarrassed to admit those things to our neighbors or our colleagues. And I think it's important to have those kinds of support networks out there in terms of a risk management strategy. I also think, looking creatively at what these animals can do and where they have value beyond the retail shelf, and one of the areas that we've really seen a lot of growth here in California is in targeted grazing for reducing fire danger. Maybe there's some opportunities now for folks to, if they've got the animals and the infrastructure in place, to take advantage of those opportunities too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's time to get creative and focus on diversifying your income streams.
Yep.
Don't I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make is work all year and sell one day. I think it's really important that you spread that out, that you really, if you're torn on whether you should retain ownership on some and run it through the feedlot at a potential loss, or whether you ought to just take the loss right now, maybe you need to sell half and keep half. Maybe you need to do partnership deals. There's a lot of opportunities to get creative. Yeah. But I think the main thing is don't sit back and be reactive. You gotta,
right.
My grandpa, one of my grandpa's favorite sayings that he told me when I first started is that if there's nothing going on the ranch, Ryan, go out and shoot something and make some work for everybody. So I think that's like the point is, it's a hilarious way you said it, but the point is that you gotta, there's always work to be done. You gotta find it. You gotta go and figure out what exactly that is and go try to get it. Don't let things just happen to you. Make them happen.
Well, and I think another way of saying that same thing, I think about when I'm no dog trainer by any stretch, but when I'm working a young dog, I make more progress when the dog is trying to do something, even if it's making mistakes, than I am when the dog is afraid to go to work.
Yeah.
And I think that's similar in this type of situation, that we make progress when we're making decisions, even in face of this uncertainty. Whereas if we're paralyzed and afraid to do anything, I think that's when we have more significant problems as a business or as an industry. One last question for you. Has this changed your day-to-day work at all? And if so, how?
Yes, it's changed my day-to-day work. And it's not so much at the beginning, but now it has. I feel like everybody is starting to crack a little bit under this shelter at home order. Everybody's a little more stir crazy. My kids are getting antsy. Everybody's getting frustrated with things. And so there's just a lot more, it seems like there's a lot more edge a lot of places, even myself. And then as far as my day-to-day schedules, I'm working from home more than going into the office, but I still go into the office. We're still working, I'd say, full speed, because we're blessed to be in agriculture where we have to provide food for the nation, and in that duty, I'm happy to fulfill it, and I'm proud of the work we do, and we're going to keep going regardless of the risk. We have to do the job. So kind of like if you're a nurse, you got to go to work. You can't not, and it's difficult and hard, and there's a lot of frustrations. And I mean, we're gonna have a terrible year on the books, but we're gonna produce the food. We're gonna get it to market, and it's gonna be cheap, but we're gonna do it because that's our obligation to the country. And I know every farmer that I talk to is pretty much the same. What about you?
I would concur that things have changed since this first started. I think there is more of an edge and more anxiety than there was maybe when we went into this. That said, kind of the day-to-day work, taking care of sheep is pretty similar to when it's normal times. I think we do talk a little bit more about planning the work so that we can maintain some safety for the people around us. Many of our, as I mentioned before, we operate almost entirely on leased pasture, and many of the folks that we lease from are in that at-risk age group. And so we're real cognizant of that, maintaining some separation and distance from those folks. But I think the other thing that I've realized, and I find myself just devouring news every morning when I get up to see what's going on. And one of the things that I've realized is that the kind of work that we do outside with livestock is so unique in today's world that people don't understand. It's actually safer, I think, for us being outside doing the kind of work we do than it would be working an office job in that regard. And I'm really thankful that I get to do that on a daily basis. I think the other thing that's changed for me is what we're doing here. We've had some time, I think, to do some pretty interesting things collaboratively with folks in other parts of the state or other parts of the world that I hope we continue after this is all over, because I think there's a lot of value in understanding how to do this more often, sharing ideas and perspectives. And I think that could be a silver lining in this cloud down the road, I hope.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of positives that have come out of this, or that will come out of this. I mean, it's certainly easy to focus on the negative side of things, but yeah, this little podcast thing that we're doing, your Instagram lives have been fantastic. You've had Joe Fisher on and a couple of I really enjoyed those. And some of the contacts that I've made and just discussions that you have with people, everybody's craving human connection so much more now that we're connecting. Yeah. And that's a really, really good thing. And there are positives. We will get through this. It is going to turn around. They are opening up parts of the country. Yep. The opening and the quarantines and all those things, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out on the meat side, because every state's going to have different regulations, which means that every packing facility is going to have different compliance regulations. And yep. Those are all going to be a fascinating test in itself. You got a dog there.
Second. Hey, we'll edit this out. The joys of border collies.
I love border collies. But yeah, I think there's I think there's a lot of positives, a lot of good things to look at. It's easy to be negative, but you gotta like, if you're gonna be proactive, you need to be positive, because that way you can. And that doesn't mean you ignore reality. You have to be realistic and you have to be honest, but you still have to go out and make it happen. And we'll be around. So.
Yep. So one last question for us as we wrap up. How can folks ask us questions that they'd like us to answer on future episodes of this?
That was an excellent prompted question. That's great. I guess the best way would be to they could message me on Instagram at California Sheep Rancher, or they could, I'm sure, message you.
Absolutely.
At Flying Mule.
Yep.
At Flying Mule Farms, or at Flying Mule?
At Flying Mule. Yeah.
At Flying Mule. Or they could leave a comment in the YouTube comments, and we get those as well. So.
Yeah. And
we're on Apple Podcasts now.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So and we'll put we've got our Instagram information on the end credits. So if you want to send us a message, ask us a question, that would be great. We'd love to get questions back.
Absolutely. And as this week goes, if anybody listens to this has something they want us to kind of focus on or unpack a little bit more next week, I think we'll probably continue this conversation a little bit more about how the markets and why the markets are doing what they're doing. I know there's a lot more detail we can get into, but if there's anything anybody want us to kind of focus on, we'd love to have a question. So. Yep,
absolutely.
All right, until next time, it's Sheep Stuff You Can Know with You Should Know with Dan Macon and Ryan Mahoney.